Hi, welcome to Great New Psychology YouTube channel's revision video for psychopathology. We are going to be working our way through the new specification topics for psychopathology, looking at both the AO1 and briefly looking at the AO3 material as well. The first thing we're going to do is look at the definitions of abnormality. The first definition being statistical infrequency. Now, statistical infrequency is the idea that abnormality is defined as behaviours that are statistically rare. So anything that is found on the extreme ends of a normal distribution would be considered abnormal. So what you could do is you could imagine your class lined up across the middle of the room, and everyone who is in the middle is normal. The people who are the shortest and the people who are the tallest, according to this definition, would be considered abnormal. With regards to the evaluation of this definition of abnormality, you might want to consider that the behaviour in question is sometimes very much desirable. For example, you could have a particularly high IQ, and that is a desirable trait. Additionally, the idea of where the cut-off point should actually lie. The second definition for abnormality is deviation from social norms. Now, that is the idea that abnormal behaviour is seen as a deviation from unstated rules about how one should behave in society. Anyone who violates those rules is seen as abnormal. So, for example, we wear clothes walking down the road, walking down the street naked would therefore be considered as abnormal. A couple of evaluation points to sort of bear in mind for this definition additionally. First off, this is very much culturally relative. What we mean by that is the idea that what is normal in some cultures and what is abnormal in that culture versus what's normal and abnormal in other cultures will vary very, very widely. Sometimes those abnormal behaviours can also be desirable. Deviance is often related to context, so if you were walking down the street naked, as I said, that would be considered abnormal. However, if you were walking down the street naked, walking down the beach naked and you were at a nudist beach, then that wouldn't be so abnormal. So, of course, related to context. Additionally, deviation from social norms can be criticised for the fact that it doesn't consider the fact that things change over time. What's normal changes over time. The third definition, is deviation from ideal mental health. Now, abnormality is defined in terms of mental health through this definition. So, ideal mental health is defined by Jehoda's 6 criteria. Those 6 criteria are positive self-attitude, the ability to self-actualize, resisting stress, being autonomous, having an accurate perception of reality, and being a master of your environment. The absence of any of these criteria suggests that you are abnormal. Now, a weakness of this definition is obviously that it is unrealistic. No one can meet all 6 of these criteria all the time at every point in their life. Secondly, another weakness is that it assumes that mental health is the same as physical health and minimises any potential differences between the two. And thirdly, a strength of this definition is that it focuses on the positives of mental well-being rather than on the negatives, which is what a number of other definitions do. Failure to function adequately is our fourth and final definition, and this is the idea that abnormality is based on the ability not to do everyday activities, sort of depending on how you look at it. So if you can't do everyday activities and you experience distress, you are classified as abnormal under this definition. It's measured using Rosenhan's 7 criteria. Now, the more of those 7 criteria you have, according to this definition, the more abnormal you are. So Rosenhan and Seligman's criteria were personal distress, maladaptive behaviour, unpredictability, irrationality, observer discomfort, violation of morals, and unconventionality. Now, the more of those you have, the more abnormal you are. A weakness of this definition is that it's hard to decide who judges whether a person is actually failing to function. Another weakness is that dysfunctional behaviour could actually be functional for that particular individual. And a strength is that the HUDAS allows us to judge abnormality effectively. The next thing we're going to look at are the characteristics of OCD, phobias and depression. Now, the characteristics of all three of those disorders are divided into emotional characteristics, cognitive characteristics and behavioural characteristics. Emotional characteristics for OCD are things such as obsessions and compulsions being a sign of anxiety. It's that feeling of anxiety, and sufferers are often aware that their behaviour is excessive. This causes them shame, disgust, sometimes embarrassment. The cognitive characteristics are the recurrent intrusive thoughts that are uncontrollable, and they create that emotional anxiety. The behavioural characteristics, that's the compulsion. The compulsion of the OCD. The obsession is cognitive and the compulsion is behavioural. So that reduces the anxiety, so whether it's washing your hands, flicking a light switch on and off, etc. These are often repetitive, and a sufferer will feel that anxiety unless they have performed that behaviour. The next emotional characteristics are that of phobias. So they are persistent, excessive and unreasonable. Now, people who suffer from these emotional characteristics of phobias, it's generally way out of proportion with the actual danger that is faced. They'll be terrified of a dog, or terrified of a spider in England, a house spider, for example. Now, those feelings are often filled with sort of anxiety, just as before, and panic, etc. The behavioural characteristics, there are a few, but the most common ones are avoidance behaviour, is obviously very common. So if you're scared of dogs, you will avoid dogs. If you're scared of spiders, you will avoid spiders. If you're scared of clowns, you will avoid clowns, whatever. But freezing or fainting also occur, and by that I mean literally freezing at the sight of seeing that thing, or fainting at the sight of seeing that thing. In terms of cognitive characteristics, irrational thoughts that underlie the thinking as well, and also resistance to any rational argument. So someone, for example, if you were scared of dogs, saying, that's only a puppy that was born yesterday, they won't be able to engage with that argument, and they will still be scared of that animal. Characteristics of depression. So the emotional characteristics are obviously sadness, worthlessness, low self-esteem, loss of pleasure, that sort of stuff. The behavioural characteristics are generally things like reduced energy and agitation, restlessness, sleeping disturbances, appetite disturbances, etc. The cognitive characteristics are negative cognitions and thoughts, and poor self-belief such as guilt, and are always or generally are irrational. The next area we're going to be looking at is behavioural explanations and treatments of phobias. Before we go any further, I want to point out that with the next few topics, be very, very careful in the exam whether they ask you for an explanation or for a treatment, because the explanations and the treatments are very, very different. Students often see the questions, see behavioural, and might start talking about treatments without seeing that they've actually asked for an explanation. Don't make that mistake. Right, behavioural explanation. So first of all, phobias. Behaviourists explain phobias through what we call the two-process model. So consider the role of classical and operant conditioning in explaining phobias. Classical conditioning explains the initiation of a phobia, and operant conditioning explains the maintenance of a phobia. Behind me you can see the grid that I'm sure a number of students will be very familiar with. If you look at the idea of pairing a white rat and loud noise, if you have your neutral stimulus, which is the white rat with no response, and unconditioned stimulus with a loud noise, that also gives you no response, etc. The two then become associated, so that eventually just one without the other will give you that same response. Now, With regards to classical conditioning, we have with regards to operant conditioning, so the second part of the two-process model, we have our example above of our friend Fetty, who has a fear of spiders. So Fetty avoids spiders because he's afraid of them. So as you can see there, the spider is there, the spider is now covered up, and avoiding spiders reduces Fetty's anxiety. Thus the outcome of his avoidance behaviour is rewarding. So this is therefore negative reinforcement. The avoidance provides an escape from the negative state of anxiety, and therefore that is operant conditioning. With regards to the evaluative material, the first thing to note is perhaps we can only learn behaviours that aid our survival. Could you condition a fear of a block of wood? Probably not, and that has been done in a study by Bregman. Another point is, and this is a limitation, what if phobias are in fact genetic? What if there is a genetic link to phobias? And that ties into the idea of the diathesis stress model, which we have discussed more in the video on approaches. So the idea is if phobias were in fact genetic, the diathesis stress model would suggest that they arise because of gene and environment interaction. So a phobia, so you could have a genetic predisposition to having a phobia, and then whether that phobia actually comes out or not is down to your environment. Finally, the model, the two-process model that takes into consideration classical and operant conditioning is of course oversimplified. Not everyone who has a bad experience with a dog develops a phobia of dogs. How can we possibly explain that? Behavioural treatments. The first is systematic desensitization, and there's three things you need to know about that. The first is the idea of counter-conditioning, so teaching a new association to replace the original one. The next is relaxation, so teaching techniques such as breathing to reduce anxiety and meditation. And then finally, a desensitization hierarchy, and that is the idea is you're gradually introduced to the feared situation. So if you are scared of swimming, for example, you might go to a pool to start with, but only look through the window. You might eventually then bring yourself down to the actual pool, all the while practicing the relaxation techniques. You might watch a video in which there was someone who jumped into a swimming pool, that sort of thing. And you build up that desensitization hierarchy, you work your way through it until you can get to that feared situation. Another behavioural treatment is flooding, which is full exposure to a feared situation. So for example, if you were scared of spiders, you practice relaxation techniques, and then you are in a scenario where there are just lots of spiders there. So it can be done actually in vivo and in vitro. In vivo is in real life, so if you were scared of spiders, you would be in a room of spiders, and in vitro is virtual reality, so you would imagine that that was happening. With regards to the AO3, so for systematic desensitization, you have to know that it can be self-administered. McGrath said that there's a 75% success rate of systematic desensitization. The in vivo technique, so where you're really introduced to that thing, is more successful. And then with regards to flooding, Choi says flooding is more effective, and Kraske said both are equally effective. But the important thing to note about flooding is that it's a very traumatic procedure. Imagine yourself, the thing that you are most afraid of, and then having to be put in a room with that thing. Traumatic. Right, the next one is cognitive explanations and treatments of depression. So depression is caused by faulty and irrational thoughts, and the first theory is the idea of Beck's cognitive triad, or Beck's negative triad. It's to do with three negative schemata of the self, the world, and the future. So people who suffer with depression become trapped in a cycle of negative thinking. The first part is negative view of the world, negative view of the self. So I'm incompetent, I don't deserve anything. Negative view of the world, thinking it's a hostile place. And negative view of the future. I will always think like this. These problems will not go away. I will always feel emotional pain, for example. The next theory is the idea of Ellis's ABC model. And I'm going to briefly run through this using the example of Beyonce splitting up with her husband, Jay, obviously because of Becky with the good hair. Now, the activating event is the fact that they break up, and now her beliefs, Beyonce's beliefs, could be either rational or irrational. If they were rational, she would tell herself that although it's a sad situation, they weren't compatible and she can learn from this experience. That would lead to a desirable emotion and consequence, such as her feeling sad but hopeful, and then a desirable behaviour, so forming a new relationship with someone else. An irrational thought, on the other hand, so an irrational belief would be Beyonce telling herself that she is at fault for this breakup, she's not lovable, she'll always fail at all relationships, and she'll forever be a single lady. That would then lead to undesirable emotions, so feeling guilty, and undesirable behaviour, so not wanting to form new relationships in the future. That is Ellis's ABC model to explain depression. So you can see there how one activating event, so a breakup, for example, bereavement possibility, leads to either rational or irrational thoughts, emotions, and then finally consequences and behaviours. Masturbatory thinking is the next thing that I'm going to talk about, and the cause of irrational beliefs. So this is an extension of what we were just discussing. So the cause of those irrational beliefs is masturbatory thinking, which is the thinking that certain ideas must be true for someone to be happy. So for example, the three most important irrational beliefs are: I must be approved of and accepted, I must do well or I'm worthless, and the world must give me happiness. Now, with regards to that cognitive explanation of depression, a strength is that there are a number of practical applications, such as the success of cognitive behavioural therapy. However, it does blame the client rather than the situation or the environment. The cognitive treatments. Now, the cognitive treatment is REBT. REBT is a form of CBT. It's not different to, it's a form of CBT. We've already discussed the A, the B and the C, which is the activating event, the beliefs and the consequences. Now the D are the disputations that you need to challenge irrational beliefs. So with regards to the treatment, the D is the thing that is most important. Now those three things are logical disputing, empirical disputing and pragmatic disputing. So you'd go to therapy and you would ask yourself, or your therapist would ask you, your cognitive behavioural therapist in an REBT session would say, does thinking this way make sense? Where is the proof that this is accurate and pragmatic? How is this belief going to be useful or helpful in the future? With regards to the evaluative material, first of all, there is this concept of the dodo bird effect, which is that all treatment methods should be, in theory, just as effective as each other. The competence of the therapist often influences outcome and success of therapy, which is a limitation. Ellis suggested that REBT is not appropriate for everyone, possibly not for older clients. And Ellis also then earlier suggested that REBT needs on average about 27 sessions, but has a 90% success rate. Biological explanations and treatments of OCD is the last area. The biological explanation of OCD suggests that OCD is carried through a gene. So the COMT gene, C-O-M-T gene, is to do with increased levels of dopamine, and as well as the SERT gene, which is to do with decreased levels of serotonin. And again, I'm going to briefly talk about the diathesis stress model, which is to do with the genetic vulnerability, and then there has to be an environmental stressor which triggers the disorder to actually occur. The worry circuit. Now, several areas of the frontal lobes of the brain, so the frontal lobes are here, of course, are thought to be abnormal in people with OCD. So people with OCD have high levels of neural activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, or in the OFC, and that is in the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, the OFC sends a worry signal to the thalamus. For example, germ hazard, something along those lines. The thalamus is then alerted and confirms this worry signal back to the OFC, and that therefore creates a circuit, and that is the worry circuit. Now, this system would normally, in a normal person who doesn't suffer from OCD, would be suppressed by the activity of the caudate nucleus, but those who do suffer from OCD have that worry circuit. The role of neurotransmitters and neuroanatomy must also be discussed, because there is a link between the two. So serotonin, first of all, so decreased levels of serotonin, as we've already said, caused by the SERT gene might cause the OFC and the caudate nucleus to malfunction, thus creating the worry circuit. With regards to dopamine, high levels of dopamine caused by the CONT or COMT gene leads to neural overactivity in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. An excess of this neurotransmitter is associated with OCD. With regards to the evaluative material in this area, so both serotonin and dopamine have multiple functions in the brain, not just OCD. Correlations don't prove causation, so biological abnormality could be the result of OCD and not the cause. There could be a third variable, there could be another factor, and most importantly, again, the diathesis-stress relationship. The biological approach does not take into consideration the effect of the environment on the individual and their behaviour. And can you make a comparison with another approach? Finally, biological treatments. There's 3 to consider. SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They block the reuptake of serotonin at the presynaptic membrane, increasing serotonin concentration at receptor sites on the postsynaptic membrane. Tricyclic antidepressants block the transporter mechanism that reabsorbs serotonin into the presynaptic cell after it has fired off. As a result, more of the neurotransmitter is left in the synapse, there is more neural activity, and the activity is obviously prolonged. The third type of drug is benzodiazepines, so things such as Valium and temazepam. They're anti-anxiety drugs. They work by slowing down the activity of the central nervous system of the brain and the spinal cord, and they enhance the activity of the neurotransmitter GABA in the brain. This neurotransmitter would usually have a general quietening effect. With regards to some final bits of evaluation there is considerable evidence for the effectiveness of drug treatments. A great appeal of drug therapy is that it requires very little effort from the user and less time. You just take it. Drugs do have, however, side effects, and some side effects can be very severe. Drug therapies can be used, but CBT should also be tried. And finally, Turner in 2008, and I think this is particularly important, and makes a clear link between the effect of psychology and the economy as well, which is part of the specification, claims that there is a publication bias towards exaggerating the benefits of drug treatment. And that could be because of the pharmaceutical industry and how much money that industry makes. Thank you.